This episode of the Better 2 podcast is brought to you by Kitty Mystic and M.Needom, author of the Better to Burnout series. Hi gang, Donna here, and welcome to the Better 2 podcast with M.Needom. And I am M.Needom. Most of you guys, though, know me as Donna from listening to the podcast. If you missed last episode, you now know that we've changed format. We had new graphics starting last season, and we have new music. Intro and outro by Fast Susie. So a little bit about myself. I am the author of the Better to Burnout series. I have 5 books out in print, and the 6th one is coming. I'm not quite sure when because life is full of mystery right now and just not sure where I'm going to end up at the second. But the book will be out sometime this year. So if you haven't checked it out, please do so. My Days with the Dark Muse starts the series, but you are not required to read that book. I wrote the 2nd and 3rd books kind of as a single person book, so you can read those and check those out and be part of the story as it unfolds. What else is going on? Synergy Collective has moved, so I'm now in Rockford doing readings out of there. So what do we have today as far as a guest? We are talking to Kathyrn K. Abdul-Baki. She has a book out called Dancing into the Light, and it is a memoir about her time as a child growing up with a very diverse background. So I think that you might check the story out because you're going to find it interesting. And her diverse background deals with having a father from Israel and a mother from Tennessee and growing up in the Middle East. So tune in. You might have heard my voice hosting the Better 2 podcast, but did you know I'm also the mastermind behind the Better to Burnout book series? The stories unravel the lives of Nigel Hartigan, the groovy bassist of Sambuca Fedora, the stunning singer-model Ava Richards, and the suave record executive singer Russell Langford. Love, romance, and drama run rampant as their lives tangle up. But brace yourself, folks, because not every tale has a happy ending. Snag your copy today from most online booksellers. Hi, Kathyrn. How are you today?
Good morning. I'm fine. Here it's still morning almost. I'm fine. Thank you.
No, it's fine. It just turned to afternoon here, so we're all good. We're all good. So you have a book out, and it's a book that is close to your heart. You have written 5 fictional books, but this book is more memoir. And tell us a little bit about it.
Well, this is actually all memoir. It's my first nonfiction book, and I wanted to write about my dancing and what led me to my dancing as an adult and getting into it with such passion. And as I was sort of doing that, meaning for it to start as an adult kind of memoir, all the memories came back of my early childhood and up to age 12, actually, because that's when the dancing kernel was sort of planted in me. And it became a memoir of my early childhood, which not only a memoir of my life, but of the places I lived in during those years of Iran and Kuwait and Jerusalem and Hawaii, which I traveled to. I'd never lived in Honolulu, but that's the way it started. I found to trace that, I had to go back to the beginning.
Well, and in the beginning is very different because your parents had different cultural backgrounds and very diverse cultural backgrounds. So, I mean, I understand from what I've read that it wasn't that big of a deal growing up for you, but if you put that just the way, you have somebody from Tennessee and then you have somebody from Jerusalem, people are automatically going to think, oh my gosh. And I mean, at a certain point, my mom married my stepfather and he was Jewish. He was not practicing. But everybody, if they heard that, they were just like, so do you know? We don't. So I get it. So, but when you just put that out there, people automatically assume, well, it must have been really hard for you. But you do describe after your mom's death how hard it was at times, because as a teenager, I imagine it was. So tell us a little bit about growing up with 2 very diverse cultures, even though it wasn't as diverse as some of us may think.
Well, it was obviously very diverse because we lived in an American compound within a very traditional Arab society of Kuwait at that time. Kuwait at that time was a very traditional society, just emerging from old-fashioned way of life. So in that sense, already the clash was there, right? In our household, because my father very much adapted to my mom's way of life, and she set a very American tone in the household. So there was never really a conflict there because we celebrated all the usual Western American holidays, Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter. And we also celebrated the Arab Muslim holidays, which are mainly about food, like Thanksgiving kind of thing. But I never felt a clash of cultures or of religions. My mother was not religious. My father was, I guess you would say, also non-practicing, except he did fast during Ramadan. But it was never, it was not a conservative household by any means. My mother never covered, none of the Western women in Kuwait covered or had to cover, or the Arab women who were not Kuwaiti, who were non-covering kind of women. So there was really early on, I didn't find really any clash. It happened after my mom passed, and my dad was sort of bewildered how he was going to raise this young budding preteen and teenager, that he sort of began to revert to his old customs. Now, all that meant really was that I didn't go to parties like my other friends did, which was maybe a good thing because they all ended up having hashish and drinking and stuff like that, which was the 60s American teenage.
Yeah.
So in a way, I mean, he was really worried about that, but it wasn't like I was forced to cover anything. No, it was just, it became much more of an Arab household than an American one at that point.
And when you talk about those parties, I mean, yes, that's very much true. I mean, he was being the typical parent that
Yeah,
gave a care. I mean, a lot
yeah,
of times
right,
now you wouldn't have that. I mean, my mom at a certain point is like, you can't wear that, you can't wear
right,
that dress because it makes you look too old.
right.
What, as a teenager, you're going, what does that even mean? As an adult, I'm like, oh, I get it. I look way older than I was supposed to be.
Yes,
Okay. But as a
just
kid, you
worried,
just think, what are you doing? You're stifling me. So
curtailing my
I
freedom.
completely understand. I had a friend in sixth grade. Her parents had just moved back to the States from Iran,
Yeah,
and they got out right before the Shah was
right.
taken and
Yeah,
removed. So that was kind of an interesting thing because she had a different concept and I didn't totally understand. I mean, she was the all American little blonde girl,
yeah,
but she knew other things. And it was kind of wild because, and at the time, I didn't have a total concept of what was going on because I'm a kid. And back then, as a kid, you were a kid.
sure, sure,
So, you know, I understand slightly what it's like to have that different culture because she experienced that. She would tell me that, oh, over here we did this. And yes, how you described, you know, Iran and things, places of that nature back in the day, they were very much still okay. They had those sections where
oh yes,
women could wear short skirts and things.
absolutely,
And now we have had the reversion of that. And I was when I was reading a little bit, you had said something that, there's hope that they can stop child marriages. And I was really shocked because I think it was about 2 or 3 seasons ago, I talked to a woman from Africa, and that is her whole journey in life right now is to stop child brides, to
right,
stop that, here, we're going to trade you something, a cow, so I can have your daughter.
right.
I mean, we think as a society in America that those things have already, we're past that. But the truth is, we're not.
You know, in the Middle East, I would say it depends on culture to culture, country to country, but also your level of education within each family. I got married at a young age, at 19, because I wanted to, and none of my other Arab friends or Arab cousins married as young as I did. Okay, so nobody forced anybody to marry. Nobody forced, my aunts were free to marry or not. I have two who did marry. Now, the youngest one was kind of married in a sort of an arranged marriage. She didn't object. She went along with it, but she was only 14 or 15 at the time. Horrified my dad. He rebelled and left the house. He was a 17-year-old young man. was very upset at his dad for doing that. But she ended up being my happiest married aunt. So, I mean, she lucked out with a really good family of in-laws and a husband who adored her. So, I mean, but yes, that is an issue among especially more conservative families. But I don't think anymore it really goes on to that extent. At least I don't know about it. But there are other cultures where it does, and more conservative, like maybe in Yemen or Oman, or, you know, as more and more people are getting educated, they're refusing to do that. To
I
get,
know my chiropractor, I don't remember exactly where her family is from,
yeah,
but her family was trying to marry her off,
yeah,
and she went to college and she met her husband,
yeah,
and they decided, no, we're getting married. She
right.
ran off, got married, and kind of pushed that whole thing that her parents wanted out of the way.
That
And
happens.
she's
That
yeah.
happens often.
And
In
I mean
fact,
that's
when people elope in Arabic, they'd say she was kidnapped. You know, she was
oh,
kidnapped. She was kidnapped. Well, it meant they eloped, but
right.
against her parents' wishes. So they'd say, well, she was kidnapped. You know, we had no control over it, so it wouldn't be so shameful. But the Arab word for it, khatife, means she went kidnapped. So
It's interesting because we are so, I mean, this is more than just this that culture. It's shame is such a big factor in the world
it is.
overall.
It really is. Yeah.
And I mean, I think that's also a factor of control, because if I shame you, then I've controlled you in some way because I've
Exactly.
invoked some kind of emotion.
Yeah.
Um, for you, what was what was your fondest memory about, I guess, being a teenager in that kind of world? Because I mean, when you came back to the States eventually, things were different for you.
You know, I had a wonderful childhood, and my teenagehood became a little bit conflicted because I went to an American school, and yet I wasn't allowed to participate in all the parties and extracurriculars. I would have been allowed to go to the prom. I did go to my prom and stuff like that, but in general, on a weekly basis, I wasn't allowed to do a lot of what the other uh, girls were able to do. When I came to the US, it was actually a huge shock. And I was amazed because I'd always considered that was because I was half Arab and I grew up in the Middle East. But all of my high school American friends who had lived in Lebanon and came here to college went through the exact same shock and being depressed and not being able to adjust because it's like going from very small town life to super big. So I was really surprised to hear that from my very American, all American friends. So that was sort of difficult adjusting here to life in this country. It took me about 2 years to stop crying.
Mm.
But I came from Beirut. I don't know if you know Beirut in the 60s, when it was early 70s when I left, was sort of like the south of France, Nice or Cannes. It was just beautiful. It was beautiful place, beautiful way of life. And so coming to Washington, D.C., which was a lot colder, bigger, impersonal, that in itself was very difficult.
I can imagine. And I
Yeah.
mean, overall, because I moved when I was in high school.
Uh-huh.
So we went from New Orleans, which was known as a very much a party town. Not that I was partying, but still the whole atmosphere there, the
Yes,
food there, everything is different.
sure.
Even the dialect is different, even though it's
Sure.
in the same state, because we moved to Shreveport. And Shreveport had more of a Texas twang, and it was more religious, and there was just such a diversity for me. And I don't think I ever really, it took me a few years to get settled, and then I didn't even stay that long because it was like, I'm out of here.
Yeah.
Because you just get to a point where it's like, I think the problem is when we move, a lot of the times we think, okay, we get a new life, everything's going to be wonderful, but you don't think about the adjustment factor.
Yes, and you said it. I mean, you moved from maybe a smaller or different culture, even though it wasn't that far away, right? But you
Hmm.
still, as a teenager, you have to do a lot of adjusting. And even though we do adapt as younger people, still, you're impressionable.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've made several moves in my life, and it's like every time you move, you have to adjust because there's different ways people handle things. I mean, you go to one city, people are like very nice, very kind, and you go to a different city, and it's totally different. When I lived in Indiana, I lived in a small town, and if I had a flat tire, people would get out and like,
Oh,
let me
sure.
help you. Let
Yeah.
me help you. And so I went to pick up some I went to pick up my husband at the time in Indianapolis, and I got a flat tire.
Yeah.
And I'm at the gas station and nobody would help me. And
Oh, yeah.
but the thing is, my stepfather, fortunately, as much as I don't have a lot of praise for him, he taught me, he's like, if you're going to learn how to drive, you're going to know how to work on a car.
That's
I'm like,
exactly
okay.
excellent. Yeah.
So I learned how to work on a car. So I got out there and changed the tire. It wasn't a big deal, but it was just the cultural shock, because here I am in a bigger city and it's like, oh, you're not the damsel in distress. We could give a damn less.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
in the little town, it's like, oh, let me help you. I mean, even where I live now, I was doing my air in my tire, and this person's like, hey, let me stop. Let me get that for you, ma'am. And I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, if you really want to, go ahead. But I can do it. I'm capable. But
Yeah.
if that makes you
That was
feel
nice.
better,
That was kind. Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
I
So
mean, you
I let him
appreciate
and
the
I thanked him.
gesture.
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly. And that's the thing. Sometimes we have to understand that people want to help us, even if we may not want it.
I
You
always
know,
appreciate help of any nature. And I try and help others. But one thing that really was a shock to me when I first came here, of course, here you're talking about 19-year-old left or just married and left and came to a different culture. What really bothered me was the fact that, well, first of all, I came to a university here, George Washington University, which is a city campus. I'd had a regular campus in Lebanon before that. And people didn't look you in the eye when you walked by on the street. People, passed each other on the street. Nobody looked anybody else in the eye. And I learned that was an not an inner city, but a city habit. You just don't make eye contact with people. And I'd been used to, in Lebanon, everybody looks at you and says, if not hello, at least they acknowledge you're there. They glance at you. Um, maybe more than you want them to, but at least you feel seen. And
mhm.
here I remember being invisible. And I just wanted to stand in the middle of the street and yell, please look at me, somebody, confirm that I'm here, that I'm alive. That really bothered me. Now, a couple of years later, when I returned to Lebanon and people were looking at me, I found that very disconcerting because I'd gotten used to people not looking, to the anonymity of a city life. Yeah, it's all very interesting.
Well, I mean, you have to wonder, would we be better off as a society, worldly, globally,
Yeah,
if we actually communicated more with each other, if we actually saw each other as a person, and actually embrace that energy? Because that's the one great thing about it. We are all sharing this energy. We just don't acknowledge it. It's
yeah,
like we're all oblivious to it.
yeah. And maybe this is particularly American. I don't know. I've been in places like Italy where people actually do stop to see if they can be of help or, more. Whereas here we really want our personal space, right? And if you see somebody's upset, they kind of want to give you your space. It's just an unspoken kind of thing. Whereas in other countries, people would be wanting to interfere and see if they could be, of help. That's been
But
my
is
experience.
Well, I mean, is it partially fear based because we're taught that, oh, that stranger could be this, that stranger could do this, that stranger may take it.
Possibly,
So, I mean, is it that we are such a culture that is based in fear? Where most of the European cultures, they embrace nudity, they embrace sexuality.
yeah,
Here we embrace violence,
yes, yes,
which is just
yeah,
nobody, we can't see a woman breastfeeding a child because, oh my gosh, somebody might.
yes,
But hey, we can watch somebody.
yes,
When I was growing up, and even when I had young children, the whole statement of before the news, please remove children or people that are sensitive,
yeah,
because this segment might be
yeah,
harmful for them.
yeah, yeah,
Now it's like whatever's on is
yeah,
on, and that's it.
yeah,
We don't care.
yeah,
And so we've desensitized. Even when we look at war, we look at violence, it's always desensitized now. It's just there,
right.
and you just live with it. I mean, I was a little kid during the Vietnam War, and I remember hearing those things, and it made an impression on me, because I was like, Mom, why do I have to leave them? She's like, just go.
Yeah,
It's like, okay,
yeah,
I understand.
yeah, trying to protect and yeah,
And I think, that goes back to your father. He was trying to protect you. And, you know, I lost my mom not as young as you. I lost my mom in my early 20s.
oh,
But
sorry.
the loss of your mother had to, especially being so young,
Yeah,
had to really, you had nobody to really confide in except for your aunts, because I know your aunt stepped in and everything, but
yeah,
it's still not your mom. So because they came from a different background. So how
that's
was
what I was
that for
going to.
you?
Yeah, well, I was very lucky that my mother adored her husband's family and they adored her. So they really jumped in full force and they always respected her ways. They didn't try and change my ways, but they were, typically more traditional Arab women. So the way they acted, and sometimes they would, come in and say, you really can't do this or that, or don't talk like this, or don't say that word, but losing your mom so early, I think, because she left the house when I was 9 to come to the United States for treatment for her cancer, and then she died when I was 11. And so I sort of felt orphaned, kind of, almost illegitimate, because that American part of me was gone now. So everything else was kind of Arab, Middle Eastern. It was great because I had that in me, but still it wasn't what my foundation had been, which was American. So I had to kind of change myself a little bit, and that became more so when my father remarried an Arab woman. She was a very modern woman, but still she had more conservative values than my mother had, and she was trying to reinforce those values that she thought were good for a young woman, and so that's when the conflicts really began. But I will say both my father and stepmother were extremely loving and kind. So, and they were good people, good adults. So there were never any real issues. There were just the regular teenage rebellion that became more pronounced because I felt, well, I grew up with these values and now I have to follow these values. That was more the conflict.
And you also lost your brother at around the age of 9 too, correct?
I lost my brother at age 9, and I guess she left home about a year later. Maybe it was closer to 10. But yes, I just turned 9.
So you had to face grief at a very young age and understand death at a very young age, which isn't always easy.
Yeah, it was very painful because, he, as I write in the book, he was a very, on the surface, very healthy, bubbly little baby. And so he went off totally healthy and never came back. He just died, during or after the operation, not long after his heart surgery, which was experimental surgery at the time. So, yeah, he just vanished. I mean, I didn't even have the preparation that he might not survive the surgery. I mean, that wasn't even talked about.
But in a way, I guess, as unfortunate as it was, it actually may have helped you a little bit with your mom's loss, with the loss of your mom.
Yeah, but well, my mother's loss was, well, worse in many ways
Oh yeah.
because yes, it's like when she was sick, I sort of knew that could happen as she progressed, but I couldn't really understand it. But the minute that I found out that she was gone, that my whole world came crashing down again. Yeah.
And I didn't mean to make light of
Oh no.
your brother. I mean, it's just sometimes I think life sets us up with a smaller tragedy to prepare us for a bigger tragedy.
Yeah, could be.
And
Yeah.
and I mean, how do you handle, I mean, how did you handle not being able to say goodbye to her?
Well, that was I did say goodbye to her in my own way the last time she was in the hospital. I pulled away. I didn't want to interact with her too much. And I
Yeah.
think it was just terror of losing her. And I somehow, of course, which led me to feel very guilty for years later. I almost wanted it all to be over with. So I wouldn't have to wonder whether she was going to get better or not get better. I just was tired of the whole thing, having to leave my family, come over here with my dad, see her in the hospital, see her so weakened, go back, catch up with homework, come back, is this sort of.
Yeah.
So when the last time I saw her, I sort of barely went up and gave her a hug and walked out knowing that I may never see her, but at the same time, not believing that it could actually happen. So of course that left with me with years, decades of guilt feeling that I hadn't acknowledged it. She hadn't acknowledged it either. Now, other people talked about it, my grandparents, but nobody sat me down and said, this is what might happen. People just weren't able to face it, I think.
I think people also back then didn't want to talk about those
Right,
things as much.
right.
Um, we watched my mother-in-law go through a long-term illness and deteriorate. And I remember getting the phone call from my father-in-law. We had seen her a couple of days before that she had passed. And it moved me. I mean, I was upset and everything. But my husband, he was kind of stoic about it all. And it took me back because it was like, how can this is your mother? How can you be like this? And he was like, she's not in pain anymore.
Yeah.
And it still, it just boggled my mind that it didn't hit him as hard as it I thought it should have. But that being said, I watched him slowly deteriorate, and he still
Oh,
was seeming pretty much, I mean, he was functionally healthy before
yes.
he passed. Even though we knew he was on borrowed time, he was functionally healthy. So it's like when he
Oh,
passed, I still felt the grief because he still seemed okay. I think there's many different forms of how we deal with grief depending on how a person passes. And yes, there is that guilt. I mean, even my mother committed suicide, and there was that guilt of
oh,
could I have done something
oh,
differently? Because I saved her once and on, and we're
oh
not.
my goodness.
But
So
the fact
sorry.
is, there was a during this time frame, I lost my mom because of that. I had another friend who lost her mother because of cancer, and then I had another friend who lost her dad, and then 3 days later, her mother died
Oh,
because she had a broken heart, and her dad suddenly
oh,
died of a virus, and she died of a broken heart, they said.
yeah.
So the grief for each of us was different because, like my other friend, like you, she understood there was this long-term illness, there was
Yeah.
this buildup, and as
Yeah.
hard as it was, she understood. Where for me and the other person, it was this sudden grief that's like you're
Yeah.
thrown, you're thrown. And I think that's the
Yeah.
thing when it's a sudden grief, even with the husband, it was he's on borrowed time, so you never know. But it's like he's functioning, everything seems fine. We're still doing what we were doing.
Yeah.
So there was still that sudden grief. I think sudden grief is the hardest thing in the world to deal with because your life is completely changed. Where somewhat when you're leading up to somebody that is terminally ill and showing those physical signs of being terminally ill, we can prepare for it better. We can prepare for that
I think you're,
switch.
and I haven't made up my mind which is the better way, but because
Neither have I. Neither have I.
I mean, I
Gone through it
think
several
for the
times. Neither have I.
person, because I did lose my dad to heart failure, and it took a couple of months for that to happen, and it was extremely sad because he was the pillar. But then I lost my stepmom just within 10 minutes. She just sat down, had a massive heart attack, and she was not totally healthy, but she was out and about and doing everything, and then she suddenly had this, and I think for my sisters especially, it was extremely difficult because there was absolutely no preparation. So yeah, we were all kind of thrown um, for a loop there. Um, I don't know, as I wrote in the book, I don't know if there's a right time or way to say goodbye, whether it's slow or long. I just feel, we just have to always acknowledge the fact that we may not be there, or they may not be there for us, and sort of keep that in mind.
I
Not
think
let
it's
not let
go ahead.
unhappiness and conflicts fester. It's not worth it.
Well, so I was going to say, I think that we are raised from that moment as little kids
Yeah,
that we can do anything. Life is going to go on, and we
yeah,
always are
yes,
never thinking about what the bigger picture is, that eventually we are all going to pass. We're all going to die. And nobody ever talks about that. We all talk about, well, what am I going to do next? How am I going to do this? Well, I got to do this tomorrow, this tomorrow, this tomorrow. What happens if tomorrow never comes?
yeah.
And that's a hard thing because we never want to talk to people about those things.
And I think our culture doesn't help us really. Um, we're not taught at an early age how to deal with death. I think if it doesn't happen to you, so that we're never confronted by it. I don't know if other religions like Buddhism or Hinduism, if they do a better job. I don't know. But I think, I don't know what the answer is, but maybe school early on, we should be able to prepare kids more for what could possibly happen. Not in a bad way, but just a way of understanding that life is a cycle, because we're all in denial, aren't we, of our
Oh yeah.
mortality. we're all in denial. Even when we see death up close, and a year later we forget about it and go on as if there will never be another one.
Well, and when you think about when you grew up and when I grew up, you were talking about how they had the bomb
Yes.
drills, and for me we had tornado drills
Oh,
in my school. But the whole fact is now you don't have that. Now you're being faced with, oh, we're going to go into a mock lockdown so we can be prepared. What kind of stress, and this is something that I think kids need, they definitely need to start working on stress and anger management and all those things in school besides teaching the basic stuff.
yes.
Because if you're not starting to teach them those things, how to navigate their mental health,
Yeah.
we're going to end up having more stress and more problems. I mean, how, did you ever think you would hear that you might go to the grocery store and get shot?
No, no,
So
no, never.
no.
Only, well,
Exactly.
I tell you, once in Beirut, because I spent several times during the Civil War, and
Okay.
then you really didn't know because there were snipers on rooftops. Everything
But
could appear just normal, and then you didn't know if you were going to go out and someone was going to shoot you just because, and from any faction, just because you happened to be, they wanted to cause disturbance.
right.
So I did feel that a couple of times, and that was extremely uneasy. That's why when people call out for a revolution and rebelling, and I said, wait a minute, you really don't understand what that entails. It's not
Mm-mm.
simply changing a system you don't like, it's a whole bunch of other things that goes on. But yeah, and growing up in the Middle East, it was so peaceful. We never had to worry about any of that stuff. So coming to that fifth grade and learning about the atomic bomb and what we were supposed to do to protect ourselves. It was just for a month or two. I was in a public school in Honolulu, and I was really puzzled. That's surprised because back in my school in Kuwait, nobody talked about those things. It's on
But
the
the,
horizon.
then when you look at this, when you really go back and you look at what they told you to help you with the atomic bomb, it's like me with
Right,
the tornado.
right.
That's not going to help you.
No, it's not.
It's not going to help you at all.
Yeah.
They wanted us to go into the hall and put a book over our head.
A book over your head.
Yes, we're supposed to crouch down, put a book over our head to protect us. And I'm thinking, that's not going to help you if the roof comes off. It's not. But here you go. Here's your false sense of security to make you
Mhm.
feel better.
Into the hall, maybe I understand because you're away from the shattering
Right,
glass. But
right,
again, depending on what kind of blast it is. But
right.
now the idea that these little kids have to be afraid of a shooter, an active shooter coming into
Yeah.
school, I mean, that I find mortifying.
Hmm.
I have a little, 7-year-old granddaughter, and I just can't imagine her having to do that. I don't know that she has, but I wouldn't.
It's it boggles the mind because as a kid, you can't be a kid then
Yeah,
because you always have to
right,
be fearful of,
right.
and I mean, we can go back to because you were over here when you were younger. I mean, I look at the restrictions now. When I was a kid, you could ride in the back of a pickup truck.
Right.
That wouldn't be a problem.
Right.
Now,
We did too. Yeah.
yeah.
You
Now that would
probably
not
still
happen.
can in small towns out in, well, Tennessee or whatever, when they're a little more on farms and things, I'm sure.
I live in a small town here in
Oh,
Illinois, and yeah, we have seatbelt laws.
oh, even
There's
in the
no way
back of a
yeah,
pickup truck, that's all gone, right?
yeah. Unless you have one of those old Subaru Brats that had the jump seats in the back with the
Yeah,
seatbelts, that's you're not doing
you're
that.
not doing that anymore.
Mm-mm, mm-mm.
Okay.
No, I mean, but that doesn't mean it's not happening in the southern states. It doesn't because they tend to not want to go along necessarily with all the laws all the time.
Yeah.
So, and I'm not complaining
Well,
about
you're not,
that,
I
folks.
know
I'm
it's just
just
different. Yeah.
yeah.
Here for sure. I mean, now my own kids are so adamant about the kind of child seat they have, and I'm sitting here thinking, oh my goodness, when you guys were little, I mean, you all in seats, but I mean that ended at age like 2 or 3 max.
Hmm.
But by the age of 8, you were not still in a child seat, which they are now,
Yeah.
until 8 or 9, I guess. That's the laws have changed. So, well,
It's interesting
yeah,
because that's just it's about safety, but
yeah.
is it really? I mean, what does the person do that can't afford these things.
Yeah.
That's where this whole thing comes, because
Yeah.
we're not even going to go there, but you know what I'm getting at.
Yeah,
It's like one of those
I
things where
do.
if you can't afford things, then what are you going to do? And
Yeah.
on and on and on.
Yeah.
So how did you get over your mom's death? I mean, I know you said you had shame and you had grief, and dancing became a huge part of this
Yeah.
to spark your joy, to make you happy.
Yes.
So how did that, you're dealing with your mom's death. How did you get out of that moment
Well,
of grief that was overcoming at times, I'm sure?
yes, it really was. And one thing that helped, we had a lady who lived with us, a housekeeper who had been there before my mom went away. And she was also from the Mount of Olives, which is a small village in Jerusalem. And so that continued. So that was a steady thing that, she was like another mother in a sense to me. And because that continued, I also had my aunts who would come and spend a few months with us in Kuwait from Jerusalem. They'd fly in. And so I had that. We had relatives. Also, we had, because I lived in this compound in Kuwait. It was an American compound with British and American and Arab expats who worked for this oil company. It was a very tightly knit community. So my mother's friends kind of took me under their wings. Um, one of them very kindly, when I was 12 or 11 and a half, actually explained a lot of, things like menstruation, and that my mother didn't have time to explain to me because she left when I was 9, that my dad had no idea how to talk to me about. And he went and asked her if she would, in fact, talk to me about those things, which she did. So I had a lot of surrogate mothers who kind of came and helped me through that. And that was the great part. Plus, everyone always spoke so glowingly of my mom and made me feel, but there was that big emptiness. I still felt empty inside. I hated Mother's Day. I hated that holiday with a passion, really, until I had my own kids and they would come home with their Mother's Day projects, from school that
Mm-hmm.
they'd made and present them to me. And I began to see, oh, okay, I can now celebrate Mother's Day again because I'm a mother. But for years I just could not, I hated Mother's Day. Um, I got over it, but yeah, and it left a total impact on me for the rest of my life, I guess, because that American part went out for a long time. Now I've lived in this country a long, long time. I came here in college and never went back to live in the Middle East except for 2 years overseas when my husband was posted there for a job in the Persian Gulf. But so that part of my life forever went away, that intimate American part, And I began to see myself more as an Arab girl, an Arab young woman, rather than half-half, which I did before. I thought myself half-half, but more American because my mother had set that tone in the house. You eventually get over it, but you come to terms with it. Let's put it that way.
That would be the
Yeah,
better way to say it,
yeah,
is, yeah, you come to terms with it, because I don't know that you ever get over it, because
yeah,
uh, that person, no matter what, if you had a relationship with them, it's part of who you are. And for you,
yeah.
it was something that was more cultural based as well, besides, because she was that anchor to the States at
Well,
that point.
she was also not very effusive and warm and cuddly. I'm sure she was, but I don't remember that. What I recall is more her intellect, her telling me to read, her wanting to read with me, wanting to know I was doing this or that, or the activity part. Be independent, be this way, be that. That's what I recall. Whereas my other Arab aunts was much more physical. My dad was much more physical. But and I wrote this in the book, after she died, I tried to think of a single time where she'd embraced me, and I couldn't remember.
Wow.
Um, she wasn't a cold person, but
No.
that was not. I mean, I'd sit in bed and sit next to her, and she'd read me Charlotte's Web or whatever we were reading when I was 8 or 9, and we'd do my homework, and I'd sit with her in bed. So I mean, she was physically there for me, but she just wasn't. Um, just hugging me all the time. And I realized with my first two children, I was a bit like that too. I was always concerned with what they were doing, what have you. And as I got older, by the time I had my third child, which was some years later, I became more physically embracing of them. And I look at my own two daughters who have children, and they are totally physically involved with their kids and hugging and embracing. And I realized because I hadn't felt that so much with my mom, I wasn't that much. Now I'm very much like that with my grandkids. But it's funny how some things rub off on you, these little things you don't really notice until you see the total opposite. Um,
I think also a little bit happens when as you get older. I mean, I've talked to people about this because even the parents that, so my husband had, his dad and mom had two kids, and then they had several years between the next three.
yeah.
And the way the first two are raised versus the way the other three were raised is completely different. And I think as younger people, we have more stress to deal with. We don't know what we're doing.
Exactly.
We have no concept. And I mean, I became a stepmom in my early 20s,
Oh my goodness.
and it was like overnight I became the stepmom.
Yeah.
So I could be a much better mom in my 30s than I was in my 20s.
Couldn't
But
we
at the
all?
time,
Yeah.
you're still trying to figure out who the hell you are.
Yeah.
And here you have somebody else to take care of. It's like, wait a second. My youngest stepdaughter actually said it very clearly to me. She goes, "You were a kid raising kids." Even though
Exactly.
but I look at her, I'm like, I'm in my 20s. She goes, "Doesn't matter. You were still a kid."
How
And
old were you?
I was 22 when they came into my life.
Oh, that's
They were
amazing. Yeah.
I was 22 and they were 4 and 6. And all of a sudden it's like, here you go. It's like,
Yeah.
oh,
Yeah.
okay. And the 4-year-old was with me all the time because she couldn't go to school and we didn't want to
Right.
do daycare
Yeah.
because the daycare, it would cost as much for me to work and just pay daycare as for
Yeah.
me to stay home with
Of
her.
course. Of course.
And I used to laugh because, and I've told this before, Easter they get boy dolls with their Barbies, and somebody had told the oldest one that sex was all about a man laying naked with a woman.
Yeah.
Okay, this is before they came to live with me, so I have to sit down and explain that's not what it is, and you're too young to know this, and we're not going to go there until you're older. But as a person that's just being dropped into this, it's like,
That's
so I got the
admirable, really, that you really navigated that, no matter how you navigated it. But
oh, I love them dearly. I had them from they were 4 and 6, they were 8 and 10, and I love them dearly. And it's the only time I got to be a mother,
oh,
unfortunately. But I mean, I just talked to the youngest one the other day, so I still
oh,
have that relationship, and she's 38. So it's
wonderful.
like
Yeah.
I didn't totally give it up. And when she was 16, her parents called me like, she doesn't want to listen to us. You need to come down here and talk to her. I'm like,
That's a compliment.
okay, so cool mom's coming, I
Yep,
guess. I don't know, but
that's wonderful.
I got away. I didn't have the dirty diapers. I didn't
Yeah.
have most of the teenage
Yep,
angst, so I
yep.
got the sweet spot.
You got the best part.
Yeah. So I mean, I think it's one of those things where watching kids grow. I mean, like I said, I could be a much better mom now
Yeah,
or when I was younger
yeah,
than I was in my 20s. And when we think about people having kids, I mean, my mom was 19 when she had me.
yeah,
So you're not quite there
yeah,
yet. You don't know. And I, you were talking about getting married and at a young age. That's the thing. When we get married at a young age, we think this is going to be forever. And most of the time it can be. I mean,
yeah,
sometimes it can be
yeah,
and sometimes it can't. But
yeah,
if you haven't settled on who you really are at that point,
yeah. It's hard.
it's not going to last.
Well, my mother married at 20. She was a year older than your mom. Had me when she was 20. She married at 19. Had me when she was 20. So as you say, she probably, and then when she was 23 or so, they went overseas, right? So she had an active social life. She was suddenly confronted with an entirely new culture, which was Tehran, and then Kuwait. So she was an American navigating this thing with a little child. I was an only child for a long time, and so I can imagine she was just distracted a lot of the time
Mm-hmm.
and excited about all these things, So, um,
Well,
I sometimes was wondering how she would have been had she been older, or how my relationship with her would have been when we got older. I never got to see that part of her. So,
No.
but she died when she was 32.
Mm.
And my stepmother came into my life a year and a half later, and she was only 25. And here I was 12 years old.
Yeah.
So, poor thing, she was a preteen, a little girl from a different culture, an American culture that she had to deal with. And I expected her to be, a 32-year-old like my mother had been and to have had all these years of experience. And here she was, a young bride, and having to navigate this. So the years when I had my own children and they became these, weird teenagers for a couple of years, that I really began to appreciate what she faced when she came and had to become a mother at such an early age. So
Well, and I
kudos
want to.
to you.
Well, I want to say kudos to your mom. I mean, even though you're saying that she didn't hug you and everything, but she did give you something that a lot of parents don't do. And I mean, I made sure I sat down with my kids and read Wrinkle in Time to them.
Right.
And I think the gift of reading to your child is
Oh, yes.
important. And I mean, I remember when they acted, so I'm reading to them and they would act like they weren't paying attention. I'm like, okay, we're done. What?
Yeah.
No, stop. Don't do that. No, I'm like, no, you're not paying attention. So why do I want to keep reading?
Yeah.
And it's like you have to read for them and let them experience a world outside of their own, and in that process you're bonding with them.
Yeah.
And I think that's what people lose track of now. We don't have that time. We are always going. And you said earlier, I think it was in the interview I had read about you too, it said that you were talking about how there was no technology and you had to send letters. And
Yeah.
in the 80s, my friend signed up. She had put an ad in a British magazine. So she got like hundreds upon hundreds of pen pal letters. She'd take what she wanted and she'd give the rest to me and my other roommate. And so we would write out these pen pal letters
Yeah.
and then you waited at the post box to get those letters.
They'd
And it's
come back.
like, we've lost all that.
Yeah, we have.
And I mean, in a way, it's unfortunate because that was the excitement. And yeah, now we have the excitement of email and it's instantaneous, but
But it's gone.
yeah,
I
you
mean, the other
can't.
day I sorted, sorry, I didn't mean to
No,
interrupt.
go ahead, go ahead,
But
go ahead.
I sorted through some old papers, and I know you've probably done this as well. And I found a lot of letters that over the years from various friends. And so I mailed them each to that person because they're kind of an archive of what we have of those years, when you were overseas in this country writing to me who was overseas in that country, here's some memories for you and your family. But we don't have those records anymore. That's the sad part, that we don't have what we had. I mean, I have tons of letters that were written a long time ago, but I even have letters that my mother had written to my grandmother that my grandmother saved over the years. And I have those in my possession, so I can go back and read them. And some of them I was able to quote in the book because I have those physical. Whereas had they been emails, I wouldn't have had any record at all.
No.
That's almost exclusively what I use now, email or electronic communication. But
I
we
mean,
miss that.
go ahead.
No, we
I
miss
mean,
that.
yeah, we do. And I mean, that's when I was cleaning off my desk. I don't even know how this letter got there. I found a letter from my mother recently.
Oh my
And
God.
I'm like, the thing also about it is you see their penmanship, you see their handwriting, there's
Yes.
something connecting to them. There's
Yes.
that energy that they took pen to paper
Yeah.
and they wrote that for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can save an email, you can print it up, but
Yeah.
still it doesn't have that lovely scroll of
Yeah.
their handwriting.
That's so true. Yeah. Well, I mean, we move on, and I guess what I was trying to write in this book, of course, looking at the world today, there's so much going on that I don't know what amount of grief counseling will counsel these people who've been going through such trauma. But in my case, the dancing and the love I experienced filled in after my mom's death, that sort of led me back into the light, which was the idea of dancing into the light is that, you take what you can, you make the best of things, and with that kind of joy in your life, you can eventually overcome, to be positive that there's light at the end of the tunnel. You can get through this, but, going through that is very hard. But hopefully at the end, if you're fortunate enough, you will have a joy and peace at the end of that.
Oh, great. So there's one last thing I want to cover real
Sure.
quick is you went to college for journalism and you decided that you'd rather write fiction instead. Why?
I worked a little bit as a journalist when I was overseas, interestingly enough, because I had very young children. And then when we went overseas, I had the ability to have, care for them. And I worked on a newspaper. I enjoyed doing a lot of, and it opened doors for me. I could meet a lot of people I wouldn't have met in my regular social context. But I found I got tired of having to adhere to the truth all the time. There was just, I got the chance to write some features, but still the features had to have been based on interviews and
Right.
reportage. And I found there was really this creative bent in me. I needed to write fiction. And I loved writing fiction. I went back and I got a master's in creative writing, and that's all I really thought I would ever write. Now I really enjoy nonfiction, reading nonfiction, and I loved writing nonfiction. I loved writing the memoir. And unfortunately, because I was an only child for a long time, I had a lot of really good, strong recollections. I didn't have to research a lot of it, except for the details I wouldn't have known as a child. But I do love nonfiction, and journalism has also changed a lot today
Uh,
than
Yeah.
from what it was when I was going to school in the early 70s. Now it's a lot more creative, a lot more. Those in those days, it was just the bare facts, the what, when, where,
Right.
why, when, why, sort of. You couldn't really veer much, and of course that was good. And sometimes I miss that, right? Because it's like the fifth paragraph by the time you get what really happened. Sometimes they're couched in all this florid stuff, and then we get to the point. But I really enjoyed writing fiction, making up, and I was able to express because I think as a fiction writer, you can almost be behind the scenes, hide behind your characters, push your ideas. They're fictional characters, right? They can do so many things that you can't do in real life. And that I was able to kind of convey some messages I wanted to convey. Um, you can't do that in nonfiction. But that said, I really enjoyed writing nonfiction, and I enjoy reading it too.
What you were saying about how journalism has changed, the first thing that comes to mind is Snowmageddon. We have a small snowstorm and suddenly it's Snowmageddon on
It
the
is
news, and it's like, really? No, it's
right.
not. But you have people from other parts of the country. Like my dad would call if we had a really bad snowstorm. He's like, "Are you okay? Is
Yeah,
it safe?" I'm like, "Yeah, why?" Or me calling about a hurricane down there. Is everything
is
okay?
everything okay?
Yeah,
Or
why?
earthquake or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, because the news has blown this
Oh,
up 10 times what it is, always.
well, when it's going to snow here in DC, because we didn't used to have such good road cleaning here, people would be lined up inside the supermarket. And I think, going back to Arab or Middle Eastern cuisine, gosh, with a bag of rice and lentils, you can eat for a week. What all these people loading up with, meats and greens and
Hmm.
all this stuff. But yeah, they heard the news, and yeah.
It snowed in New Orleans one time when I was a little kid. I have home movies of it. It was like less than an inch. We had 2 inches here yesterday, and the whole city shut down. And yeah, I mean, now,
In New
yes, people
Orleans.
would,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
people
because
would make
they
a,
didn't have
no,
the ability to clean it up
no,
properly. Sure.
no. And I mean, now, yes, they would go and raid the store because we don't know how long it's going to be. It's
Yeah.
like, it's not that serious,
Yeah.
folks,
Yeah.
because you guys will warm up really quick and it'll melt really quick.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's interesting how media has changed, and now you get journalism stories from so
Yeah.
many different sources, and you got to
Yeah.
check them. You have to check them.
Oh, of course. You have to check them, and primary sources are always, that's where I go to for anything I want to, or what you think is a primary source, right? Um, yeah, I found it, to get back to your original question, a little too confining. So I felt that writing fiction was more, I love research and I love doing all that. But when it comes down to it, I wanted to have more leeway in what I wanted to write about.
I
Um,
mean, I think a lot of people don't think about it as even writing fiction, at least for me, because I'm writing books from the 1980s. I have travel books from like 1985,
yeah,
1984
yeah.
from certain places because, yeah, oh, yeah, everything's on the net. No, it's not, because there's restaurants that are not,
Oh,
that were
right,
then, but they
right,
don't exist.
right. And
And
times were different then.
yeah. So
You
I mean, there was a quote I read the other day. It was in one of the one of the travel books, and it was 1985, and they're talking about how plastic cash has become more accessible now. More people are taking credit cards, and I'm just like, plastic cash. I mean, now
that
it's
what it
like
was
that's all we
called?
deal with. Yeah, yeah. They called it plastic cash in quotes, and I'm just like, okay. And I mean, I was in high school. Actually, I had just graduated in 85, but it's just like, I didn't think about those things. And we didn't because we had cash. That was it.
Yes,
And there you went.
yes.
So, yeah, it was just really weird to see that highlighted specifically. And then they broke down what credit cards were taken at these restaurants.
Ah,
So is rather amusing. What is your next? Do you plan on writing another book after this? Or are
well,
you just gonna?
yeah, give us just poof, throw in the towel. No, I think once you're a writer, as you know, because I understand you've written many books as well,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um, it's like an addiction. So you may get, I'm enjoying now sort of promoting this one and just enjoying basking and having it done. But no, I've started another one, which is a bit of a sequel, except it's written differently. It's more in the form of essays or vignettes, but about different later parts of my life, because this was purely about my childhood, done chronologically, with some flashbacks with the dancing segments.
Mm-hmm.
But this other one will be more different times. So it's also a book of and living in the Middle East and living here in a bicultural way. It always will have the bicultural aspect, I think. But like you were mentioning about Iran, we were living in Bahrain the eve of the Iranian Revolution, and Iran and Bahrain are like 10 minutes by plane, right? And we saw it every night on the TV, but none of us imagined that the Shah of all people would be ousted. I mean, it was
Mm-hmm.
sort of like, oh, well, this will boil over and, blow over. And lo and behold, it did not. The whole world changed after Iran, the whole
Yeah.
the Middle Eastern part. So, yeah, we watched it unfold before us, but we were a little bit in denial at the time. Um, so there's a lot of interesting things to write about that, how we were then and how we are now. And yeah,
Well, yeah, and compare and contrast is always an amazing thing because I think if you look at where we are now versus where we were,
yeah,
you can see the growth, you can see the evolution, and the one thing that people seem to have forgotten is history does repeat itself,
yeah.
especially if you
Oh,
haven't learned it. And here we
yeah,
are again.
yeah,
So it's like I think if you share your life, and I said this to somebody yesterday, you've been placed on this journey
yeah.
because you are meant to teach people and show people how to heal, how to do other things. And for you, it's to show them that the cultural differences really do not matter, that they may change things, they may slightly skew things, but you grew up during in a place at times where most of it was very similar. I mean, I can go to a grocery store in a little bit bigger city and I've seen a woman in full garb,
Sure.
head to toe covered completely. So I mean, we can, because I live in outside of Chicago. When I lived in Chicago, there was so many cultures there in Chicago itself.
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing we don't realize. Even in this country, we are very multicultural,
Oh,
and
yes.
we need to embrace that instead of going, oh no, we can't have that. It's not going to change. We are multicultural, and that's
Yeah.
who we are. That's why we have the Statue of Liberty.
Well, that's right. And talking about Chicago, because my daughter was there for a while she lived there 2 years, and I'd go and visit her. And I always felt so bad for the Africans, the cab drivers, who I thought they come from a warm, lovely country. They have to, how do they manage the Chicago winters? I mean, that just thought of all the places they could come to. Maybe Miami would have been more
Yeah.
suitable. But we are multicultural, and I will say, when I was little in school, in the Kuwait government school I went to, all my friends' mothers wore the full garb, and some of the masks were like the sort of gold colored or black shiny. It was sort of intriguing. We don't see that much anymore at all, except some places, very rarely though. But in your average Arab city or something, that's not something you typically see all the time. But and sometimes it bothers me when I see a husband walking next to a fully covered woman and he's wearing shorts.
Mm-hmm.
That bothers me. I mean, as an Arab woman, it's very hard to keep my mouth shut and not saying, well, how come she's dressed like that and you're dressed like this, you know?
Yeah, yeah,
But as long as someone's not forcing anyone to wear or cover whatever, that's fine. What I don't hope is not happening is when it's required that she cover. But a lot of
yeah.
people do like to cover anyway. None of my aunts ever covered, none of their daughters, my cousins ever did, but I have some of their daughters now, this new generation, that just covered their sorry, I'm just gonna
Okay.
some of my kids' generation, young women have decided to wear, scarf, one or two. But I mean, that was not at all when I was growing up. So it's almost like a revert going back to the more traditional and maybe response to economic conditions, political conditions. Maybe people are trying to make a statement of some sort.
Well, think about it this way though, too. If you are covering your face, let's say you're
Yeah,
covering your face,
yeah.
facial recognition is not going to work that
Right.
well.
That's another thing. Oh, if you're going out on any kind of protest, you might as well do that because, all that they, who was it? I heard someone on the news the other day was saying they should, I think it was one of the presidential candidates, that they should take those faces of anybody out protesting and, send them to whatever powers that be. And I thought, hey, what's going on here? I wanted to come to this country from the Middle East years ago so I could have freedom of expression and speech, which I thought was lacking there. And I thought, America, I can say, do whatever I want. Well, what's going on here? This is very disturbing to me. To me, it's really very disturbing.
Well, there was a story not too long ago about license plate scanners that are just popped up on the side of the road. It's a little solar group that's got a camera,
Um,
and they allege that the reason they're doing this is because they can track cars then. So if a car is involved in the crime and they have partial license plate,
right,
they can get that license plate and then they can track that person. And
right.
but let's be honest, most cars that are involved in a crime, 9 times out of 10 have already been stolen.
Yeah, right,
So
right. Yeah.
I,
It's just,
I often go to, and I know somebody will blast me for this, but I have to say it. I often go to the fact that after 9/11, we ended up where we have to watch everything we take on a plane. Now
right.
you can see the commercial economic factor that now the airplane is making more money selling you things that they used to give you for free.
Oh, right. Correct.
But but we have to make you feel safe. And I was lucky enough to fly first class 10 years ago. And so I flew first class and they come to us, they're like, would you like something to drink? And we're like, sure. So they hand us a real glass. And I look at my husband, I'm like, so I could break this, right? He's like, yeah, you could. I'm like, all right. Mm-hmm. So then they bring us our
Your
meal
weapon.
and they bring us these a butter knife that's got serrations on it and a fork, a metal fork. Both are metal. And I looked at him and I'm like, so obviously terrorists don't sit in first class, right? And they're not going to come from the back of the plane to get this stuff, right? Because they made him get rid of his little cuticle scissors that
Oh,
were
yeah,
in
of
his
course.
bag. I'm like,
Yeah. Clippers
but you're
or anything like that you might use. Yeah.
but you're giving me you're giving me weapons basically.
None of it makes sense. And yeah, I mean,
I often call it political theater because that's
well,
pretty
yeah,
much what it is. It's political theater. You're creating this illusion that we're all safer, but the truth is, if somebody really wants to do something to us, it's gonna happen.
yeah, yeah. No, I totally agree. A lot of this is just nonsensical, that they can see that you are, they sometimes make mothers empty all the formula, whatever they're carrying in their, and I thought, oh my goodness.
I had my dad gave us a cat and we had a soft carrier and she was already, I mean, she was in the carrier. She wasn't used to being in the carrier, but she was a good cat. So this was okay. But at the time, they're like, okay, well, you need you to take the cat out of the carrier. It's just a little baggy carrier. There's nothing here. We need you to take the cat out of the carrier so we can X-ray the bag.
Well, would they have caught the cat when she squirms free?
That I don't know, but fortunately, I grabbed the cat. The cat was fine. The cat was fine on the inside of the plane. Nobody even knew I had a cat. But the whole fact is, that was my thought is like, okay, I'm going to take her out. She's going to bolt, and then
Yeah,
what?
exactly.
But she didn't. But I mean, it was just one of those things where it's like,
Yeah,
what am I going to do?
Yeah. I mean, some of it makes no sense at all. And then some people smuggled these guns, and you wonder, how did they get away with that? There was a congressman who had in his carry-on luggage, he had a pistol. And you said, well, where are you thinking? I mean, they take nail clippers. They're not going to allow a pistol on, in your carry-on luggage.
I got stopped because I had a Tigger on my key ring at the time. They didn't know what it was. So I had to go into my purse and pull out my keys so they could see it. But yeah,
Yeah.
sometimes you completely, and that's getting off track, and I didn't mean to go there, but it's one of those things where it's like you've
Sure.
seen, especially you in your lifetime, you have seen these transformations and how, yeah, oh my gosh, when you used to travel, your loved one could meet you at the
Oh,
airport
yes.
gate and it
Oh,
was so wonderful to give
yes.
you flowers or a
Yeah.
hug or whatever. And now, no, I see you in baggage claim.
Yeah, that's the part that saddens me because we used to be able to meet our loved ones way up front or, um, you know, say goodbye to them way out there. I don't know. Yeah, traveling is totally different now. You have to sort of wave to them and they go in this long process of sitting another
Yeah,
2 hours and,
yeah.
wherever they're going. Yeah, the world has changed, unfortunately.
But hopefully one day we'll see
Yeah,
a brighter tomorrow.
yeah,
Hopefully, maybe
I
not in this
hope
lifetime,
so.
maybe the next one, but who knows?
Yeah.
Who knows? Is there anything we didn't talk about that you would like to like to say something about?
Um, no, just well, maybe that when I grew up in the Middle East, things were very calm and wonderful. It was a wonderful life, and now when I look at it and I see all the conflict going on, it bothers me a lot. And I say, this is totally unlike the Middle East I know. So when things settle down a little bit with the current situation, I hope people will travel more to the Middle East, enjoy, because really the people are so warm and friendly and welcoming, especially to Americans. And so, I would encourage people to go travel, enjoy, Egypt, North Africa, um, anywhere. Jordan is amazing. Lebanon, Syria, when it calms down again, Syria. Um, so just, I would encourage people to go because Turkey, you would enjoy the Middle East. And all we see on the news is conflict these days, but that's not really the Middle East I knew at all.
But once again, it goes back to journalism. So sometimes we are painted to see
Sure,
the darkest things in the world because it's ratings and it sells
sure.
papers.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I think sometimes we get disheartened and we lose hope because that's all we see all the time.
Well, and whether it's journalism or even fiction, where there's no conflict, there's no story.
Right.
Tom and Jane loved each other and got married. There's no story there. So you've got to create a conflict. And so what's going to lead that news story that day is the conflict.
Yeah.
And that's the way we're trained as journalists, or even, as I said, fiction writers. We, look for the conflict. Um,
Yeah.
so that makes a good story. And so that's unfortunately what we see. Yeah.
Well, I thank you, Kathryn.
Oh, thank you so much, Donna. This has been a sheer pleasure. Yeah.
Hi, gang. Donna from the Better Two podcast here. If you've listened to my show, you know that it always sounds great. That's thanks to the guys at Third Ear Audio Productions. Third Ear Audio helps podcasters, broadcasters, musicians, and business owners get their important messages out to their audience. Rich and the Third Ear Audio team are easy to work with. They're efficient in understanding that your message is important to you. With quick turnaround and a true caring of your needs, Third Ear Audio is your go to for any audio message. Reach out to Third Ear Audio at 312-388-5596. Rich and his team will deliver for you. That's 312-388-5596. Or you can email them at info@thirdearaudio.com or visit them on the web at www.thirdearaudio.com. Today, I would like to tell you a little bit about one of my favorite places, Synergy Collective, a bohemian lifestyle brand curating wellness for the mind, body, home, and soul. Located in the heart of the Midwest, Rockford, Illinois. Inside the storefront and online, you'll find a beautiful selection of crystals and metaphysical tools, boho apparel and accessories, sustainable home and beauty items, books, candles, and other unique gifts. They also offer a variety of community events, classes, and workshops in their Rockford location, including some select classes that are taught by me. So I invite you to explore the collective at www.shopsynergycollective.com and use code BETTER215 at checkout for 15% off your first online purchase. So Kathyrn and I had a very diverse and interesting conversation. When you look back at the world in the 60s, you can see a much more innocent time. And as we discussed, her dad kept her from those parties. Okay, well, I was a kid in the 80s and or a teen in the 80s, and my mom, not my grandma was okay with me going to parties, but not that that matters anyway. But I didn't go out a lot. But when I was living with my grandmother, she was okay with me going to a party. It didn't matter. I was hanging out with my girlfriend, so it was okay. However, with my mom, well, you better not wear too much eye makeup. You better not do this. You better not. And that was all her way of keeping me to be her little girl still and trying to keep me out of trouble. At the time, I may not have seen it, but as you get older, you can look back and appreciate that somebody actually was caring and looking out and saying, okay, I don't want you to fall into the wrong crowd. Because sometimes if we don't have that person to pull us back, we may end up getting ourselves in trouble. Even though at the time, as a young adult, we think, I got this. I know what I'm doing. And, it was easy to talk to Kathyrn for the sheer fact that we both shared that commonality of losing a mother at a younger age. Granted, she lost hers at a much younger age than I did. And I'm not sure I could have handled it, but in a roundabout way, which I really didn't discuss with her, is the fact that being raised by other people, whether it be the fifth grade teacher or my grandmother, in a way, I lost my mom after that divorce because I had other people that raised me. It wasn't necessarily her that was putting that, here, I'm influencing you. And I think that in a way, sometimes that can be a saving grace because, like with Kathyrn, she learned that her mom, when she thought back about it, her mom wasn't that overly emotional person. Her mom was there for her to read stories with and share things of that nature. But she wasn't the let me give you a big hug, where my mom initially was that person. She told me she loved me. She was there. She supported me. She gave me the hug. But somehow after the split, something split in my mom, and I became more like the person that she saw as my dad. So the fact is, we have to look at our parents, and we've talked about this before on the show. Look at our parents as who they were. Forgive them if we can. And even if we can't, I'm not saying call them up and say, oh, I'm so sorry. Forgive them for yourself. Forgive them to heal your heart. Forgive them because they were human, just like you are. And sometimes we have to look at those things and say, you know what? It's okay. I got this. I can handle it. And so embrace forgiveness because that's going to be healing for you. Yeah, sure, they may still drive you nuts and their views may not be the same as yours, but they're part of the reason for who you are, good, bad, or indifferent. I'm not saying blame them. I'm just saying accept it, own it, be you, own you, and do you. So I would definitely check her book out. It's called Dancing into the Light. And she's a really interesting lady. And I think she's, her next book should be interesting as well, since it'll be kind of along the lines from what she described of My Days with the Dark Muse. Sorry to self promote, but the fact is that book is basically little vignettes of Nigel Hartigan's life. And that, as soon as she said it, that's exactly what I thought of. So to me, when a book is written in slight essays and slight stories like that, it's easy to digest. It's a quick read, and you can go through and see how a person grows because it's more intimate at times. Anyway, on that note, I hope you guys like the new format. And as always, if you have a question, you can drop me a line at Donna, Dauna, at Better2 Podcast. Our sound is done by Rich Zei of Third Ear Audio. And our intro and outro music is done by Fast Susie. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed the show, and I'll catch you next time. Bye.